that working? Yes. All right. Well, thank you very much, Scott. And yeah, thanks for the invite. Yes, it says 18th of April for you guys, but it's the 19th for me. But it's an honor to be here, and I hope to entertain you for a little bit. Get my timer started. So my name is Emmet Maroon, and I have developed this crate called Duplicate that Scott has invited me to talk a little bit about, and then also about some of the peculiarities about procedural macro development, because they are quite a niche thing in Rust. So just to begin, a little bit about me. I am from Israel and Denmark, half. But I'm currently living in, as I said before, Vienna, Austria. My background is I have a master's degree in computer science from the Danish Technical University, and I'm currently in Vienna to do my PhD and hopefully get it done by end of this year or early next year, if everything goes to plan. Since this is kind of a Rust-focused or programming language-focused meetup, I thought it would be interesting just to go on a little bit about what I've been doing professionally. I've also done a lot of Java. I had 5 years in a bank where I mainly did Java, but I'm out of that now, and now do mostly C++. I work on LLVM, so I'm forced into to the C++ ecosystem, where also Python is quite heavily used. And so everything I do in Rust is on my own time, but I've been doing it, I think, since 2017. So it feels like a long time, and it's been quite rewarding. So what we'll be talking about today is first a little bit of motivation of why I got started on this duplicate crate. And then I will get into a little bit of an overview of it. I won't go into all the details on how to use it and what it does, but just to give a taste of 99 or 95% of the use cases for it. Then I'll get into some tips and tricks for how to use it with some other stuff to get a little bit more usability out of it. And then I'll be talking about these peculiarities that procedural macros have, and if you're thinking about developing one, then maybe a few points that might be good to have in mind. And then I'll end with that conclusion. So everything actually got started with a completely different crate that is technically on crates.io, but is not released by me in any real sense. It's called Graphene, and the idea of it was to have this extensible graph data structure crate. And so here, these two figures are graphs, of course, where on the left you have directed graphs, on the right you have an undirected graph. And so this crate was about being anything graph related. And essentially, the origin of Duplicate is the story of testing graphene and my needs in that sense. So it all started with this directedness that I talked about, and what I've shown here is two tests I needed to make early on. Exactly what they tested isn't important, but the difference, the important bit is that I would always have two versions of any test I was making: one version for the directed graphs and one version for the undirected graphs. So, for example, if you're doing a search, well, then searching in a directed graph and undirected graph is essentially the same. And so testing is therefore also essentially the same, except with a small bit that I've highlighted in green here, that I'd have to provide the directedness as a generic. And so in a small scale, it doesn't matter much, but after hundreds of tests, it adds up. So back in the day, I created a macro specifically for that, and the only thing it did would duplicate a given test I make, and then in the green you can see here it looks for the word directedness and then substitutes it for either directed or undirected, just as I had in the beginning, right? So it would expand to exactly this we had before, and this was all fine and dandy until, of course, the next detail comes along, And that's the fact that within graph theory and all stuff graph related, there's often multiple ways of doing stuff. So for example, if you're searching through a graph, you could do a depth first search, or you could do a breadth first search. But many of the features of searching are the same. So this test we have here is, for example, ensures that you're only looking at each node in the graph once, right? And whether you're searching in depth or breadth first search, that still holds. And so now we need 4 tests. We need one for DFS with directness and BFS with undirectness, and so on, right? And so I had to make another macro that would then do the same as the previous one, but now just substituting what search algorithm is used in the test, and to test all the combinations. And now you can actually begin seeing the early syntax of what I will then take over into this duplicate crate. Yeah. So this will expand to 4 different test cases, right? And so the next thing comes along, and what I've shown here is a 2 out of 8 different calls to a macro I had to make called edge lookup method tests. And these tests are all the tests around how to access the graph. So I want this set of nodes, or I want this set of edges. And they're all very similar with small differences, right? Like which one is exactly I'm testing for and stuff like that. So this macro was specifically designed to expand into however many tests it was that are all mostly the same, but then slightly different in these small ways. Right? Oh, and by the way, you can also see that I would also be testing whether I'm accessing the graphs in mutable fashion or not. Yeah, so all this added up. And so to sum up what all these problems were, I was always having to make new macros for the next kind of duplication I was going to do, or where I didn't want to repeat myself too much. And one big issue, this was maybe earlier on, was that I also didn't have any syntax highlighted, because I was using IntelliJ, and I think it's changed now, but back in the day, IntelliJ wouldn't give any syntax highlighting within macros. And so my macros were encompassing all of my test code, and so I didn't have any syntax highlighting for my testing, and that was really annoying. I think it's changed now. I think IntelliJ at least tries, and then sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Another issue I had was the recursion limit. For those who don't know, maybe haven't used macros all that much, if you have a macro that expands into something that has another macro in it, well, then the next macro has to expand too. And so that counts as macro recursion, I'm going to call it. And the default maximum of how many times you can do that is 128. And usually that is fine. But the way that these macros I've shown you so far work is that they kind of have to recurse almost every time they see a new word or a new token in the code. And so this limit will be reached quite quickly. And luckily it's not a fixed limit. You can increase it, but I would always have to increase it again and again and again. And the maximum my code reached was having to put a limit on this 8,192. Right? And every time you want to increase this limit, you essentially have to double it. Otherwise, you're gonna reach the limit again quite fast. I also experienced some compile time issues. Now, I'm not really sure about this, and it's also quite a long time ago. So exactly what I'm saying now, don't take my word for it, but I'm pretty sure that macros of the scale I was using had quite a high compile time, and it scales at least linearly, if not exponentially, with the amount of code in the macro. And so moving over to a procedural macro reduced compile times for me, at least. And I'm guessing it's because when macros are expanding into other macros, and especially doing this, like when you're scanning through everything, the compiler is having to do pattern matching and reinterpreting the code again and again and again, and that takes time, right? Whereas a procedural macro, it's just a one pass thing that should go pretty quickly. But I haven't done benchmarking on this, so no promises. Yes, so after all of this, I thought, let's give procedural macros a try. And so let's go over what this duplicate crate does and a little bit how to use it. The idea is, of course, to avoid repetition. And the type of repetition I'm talking about is when you find yourself taking a piece of code, copying it, and then just changing a few things, right? And so instead of copy pasting, duplicate allows for this, for a sometimes parametric substitution of duplicates, and then all of the duplication will be done for you. You just have to highlight the places that some things have to change. So if we take a look at a quick example here, this is the same code as I've shown you before, the macros I used before, just in using the duplicate crate. On the first line, you can see we have this attribute called duplicate item. And within it, you then define how many duplicates you want and how you want them to change. So the first line defines a number of substitution identifiers. In this case, it's name and directedness. And then for each line after that is one duplicate of the code that follows this attribute. So the first line you can see would be then the duplicate that uses the directed graphs. And then the one after that is the undirected graphs. And if you look into the code, you can see we then use the substitution identifiers name and directedness. And that's exactly where the macro will scan the code. And every time it sees the identifier name, it will substitute it for the relevant bit of code you put in the brackets. And this will expand to exactly the same as you saw in the beginning. Yes, we also have a function-like version of duplicate item, which is just called duplicate here. The syntax is exactly the same, except that it's within the first brackets, and then it duplicates anything that's after that. So it could also duplicate more than one function at a time. You could have two functions at a time, if you like, or it could be within a function, so you're just duplicating statements. And yeah, you can have more than two identifiers. You can have more than two duplicates. You can have 10 different duplicates if you like. But this is, yeah, I would say 90% of the use of duplicate, this type of, I just want to copy this and change a few things, quite simply. Then we also have something called global substitution. And this code is exactly the same as before, except for the extra line you see above that I've called arb-g. This is called a global substitution, and that is because this substitution will be the same for all the duplicates it will create. So we're still creating only two duplicates, but whenever it sees arb-g, it's going to exchange it for arb connected graphs and arbitrary connected graph. And yeah, this might be useful for you. I would say that's the next 5% of use cases for duplicate, but I've added it here because it's going to come again later. Yes, and this will again expand to exactly the same as before. So that's kind of most of the syntax I will go over for duplicate for now. Some other feature it has is this parametric substitution that I'll get into a little bit later. Then we have verbose syntax, which is essentially a different way of writing these substitution identifiers and what they should be substituted with in cases where this column-based syntax doesn't really fit because maybe you have a lot of stuff in one place or something. But that's not going to be used today, but it's in the documentation if you need it. Then we have nested invocation, and that's essentially for doubling up of stuff. So it would be used, for example, if we wanted to make out of our just two direct or indirect tests, we also want to make them for the DFS and BFS. Then you could use nested invocation to not have to repeat the fact that you're first having to duplicate for DFS or BFS and then for the duplication. But again, that's out of the scope for now. And lastly, we have module disambiguation, which if you if you notice here, we're having to specify the names of the function each time in each duplicate. And that's because if we don't do that, then the functions will have the same name and the compiler will complain. Module disambiguation makes this easier if you're duplicating modules, then it will rename the modules for you. Because often, yeah, you don't care about module names. And that might be a feature we expand for more other items at some point in the future. Good. So that's kind of the overview of duplicate. And now on for some tips and tricks you can use with duplicates. First of all, I would advise you, if you're using it and you kind of finish what it is you're doing, especially if you're creating a crate, that you then turn off the default features of duplicate, because they include all the features that newcomers would need, but also features like expanded error reporting. And if you're done, you're probably not needing error reporting stuff, and that might increase compile times. And so if you're making a crate, for example, don't force all of your users to then have to use all of the stuff in duplicate. Then a caveat, this crate is no substitution for abstraction. So I want to be clear that I advise you to use, the proper type features of Rust and stuff, instead of just using this for duplicating everything. And so that's also why my main use for duplicates actually within tests, where abstraction is not really worth the effort. But of course, there could be places in real, non-test code where you could use duplicate. But there might be code smells that you should avoid in using duplicate. Yeah, my kind of go-tos are that duplicate is there in non-test code. It's there to show the differences between very similar code, and especially to future-proof it, so that, if you have two versions of something that are very similar, and you in the future have to change one, well, then if you're using duplicate, you don't have to remember to change the other one. It will happen automatically. Yeah, so this, I now have an example of kind of when not to use duplicate and then when to use duplicate. This is a bit of code from a different project I'm doing around assembly code and simulator for it. And so I'm here trying to test different programs, what kind of inputs. If you give it an input of 0, then the output is 1, or give it an input of 1, the output is 2, and so on. And here you can see I'm not using duplicate, even though I am duplicating the testing, right? I'm doing the exact same thing for each input, but with a different input rate. But I'm not using duplicate because even more is happening in the background. I'm also testing whether the code is given in textual form or in binary form. And so this macro will expand to code that will generate both things. And I'm also testing the output in two different forms, human readable and machine readable. And so all that logic is not really, that's not what duplicate is meant for. And here, a normal macro is a better use. But at some point after I had this running, I also needed to test some of the statistics the simulator was outputting. And so I added this bit here. It's shortened down. It's actually a bit more. I'm only showing 2 statistics here, how many bytes are consumed and how many instructions are read. But I have at least 10 different types of statistics I've checked. And what you can see here, for example, is that for the same program, the same number of instructions need to be executed, right? 2. But depending on the data type, the number of bytes consumed would be different, right? So it's either 1, 2, or 8 in this case. And so what you'd notice here is that regardless of what happens in the future, even if I change the program a little bit, the instruction numbers will always be the same, but the bytes consumed will be slightly different, right? So this is a perfect case for duplicate. And this is the result here. We've extracted the statistics into duplicate item attribute, and we're using here parametric substitution to define the byte, the data size that changes in each case, right? So you can see that shared metrics will be substituted with the two statistics, but the consumed bytes will then depend on the value 1, 2, or 8 instead of being constant like the instruction reads are, which is 2 every case. So that's kind of in my head the difference from when will I use duplicate and when will I stick to the normal macro rules, right? If I have some logic in my duplication, then duplicate's not there. If it's just a find and replace, then that's where duplicate shines. Yes, another kind of pattern that you might encounter, and that this is actually a specific example from a user that made an issue. We have here, they wanted to do some benchmarking, and they were benchmarking using some test function that takes a number, right? And so they're making one benchmark for each number, and they want to choose duplicate to reduce the duplication here. Only problem is, again, with these function names, it was a bit annoying that you have to define the function name as you saw before. So there is a trick using another crate called paste. It's meant to allow you to concatenate two identifiers, or an identifier number into one identifier. And so what you can see here is in the attribute for duplicate, we haven't specified the function names, but instead of the function name, you can see there are these brackets with the larger and smaller than signs. And then we have this bench underscore num, and num is, of course, will be replaced, will be substituted by duplicate, and then paste will take over and will concatenate bench with the given number. And so this will expand to all the cases that you saw before. This is a nice it's called symbiosis of these two crates that helps you again avoid repeating yourself. Of course, a little bit of a note, it can be a code smell in cases like this, where you're repeating stuff in such a simple case, and especially when you're using numbers like this. If you're in testing, for example, maybe you should think about, okay, should I do some other type of testing here that's a bit more robust? So for example, if you're testing all the numbers, then instead of specifying 10 random numbers that you give yourself, perhaps you should use something like quick check or some type of property-based testing instead of using duplicate for this. I see there is a comment. Yes, and another thing is, and you probably experienced this before, but you can't use macros everywhere. And so I have two cases here of things you can do when you want to use duplicate for something in a specific area, but can't because Rust doesn't allow. So in the first case here, which is again a use case from one of duplicate's users, they wanted to duplicate the integer value given to members of a struct. And in this case, so the two members would be 1 and 2, and they both need to be 0. And they kind of wanted to avoid having to specify 0 everywhere. And their original idea was to use it inside the struct initializer, but that's not allowed by Rust. And so what you can do instead is kind of look for a higher level where you are allowed to use duplicate, and then wrap it in where it is you need duplicate. So here we're not actually doing duplication. We're just specifying one substitution and one duplicate. So there will only be this code will just expand into itself, except with the keys identifier changed to the values here. And so this allows you now to use duplicate in an area that you're not technically allowed to. Another case of this would be if you want to use duplicate to duplicate match arm cases, and again, you're not allowed, macros aren't allowed in that position. So what you can do instead is wrap the whole the whole match statement in a duplicate. And here we're using a dummy instantiation. It won't do anything. It won't even substitute anything. But because duplicate kind of recursively calls itself early, this will expand the call of duplicate that's inside the match first. And so you were then allowed to use it where you want to, even though Rust technically doesn't allow it. So this is kind of a workaround for this case. And I've actually myself needed to do this on multiple occasions, because sometimes even refactoring to make the bodies of the statements into functions is not allowed in some cases, for example, by the borrow checker. So this is a solution for that. Yes. So a little bit about procedural macros. And so duplicate is fully a procedural macro with no other code in it. And through my development of duplicate, I've been doing it 3 years now. Users have found some odd things, and I found some odd things myself that might be helpful for you if you're using procedural macros, but especially if you're thinking about creating one. So the first one is a little bit about testing. So how do we go about testing procedural macros? The first one would be what I call functionally. You test that given some call to the macro, the code that is produced behaves correctly, right? So if it produces a struct, well, then that struct is available for you to use in a different function or something. And I think that's kind of the normal way of testing stuff, right? Another way of testing macros would be what I call literally. And here it is that you don't test that the code works, but you test that the code expands correctly, right? And whether it works is then kind of assumed. And that is what duplicate does. Using a crate called macro test, we can test whether, given some call to duplicate using attribute or the function-like version, that call becomes some other specific set of code, right? And last time Scott told me it's something, it's very much akin to snapshot testing. We're not testing whether the code works, we're just saying this becomes that, right? And from the example you've seen today, the testing would be, given some of the duplicates, they become the code we saw earlier. Now, this is a little bit of a problematic situation for duplicate, because I assume not too many crates or procedural macros use this style of testing. So it's kind of an immature tool chain or set of libraries. For duplicate specifically, macro test has effectively become unmaintained. It's maintained by only one person, and that person I don't think has any more time to devote to it. So it's, yeah, I don't remember last time I saw a new release of it, and it no longer does enough for us. So now we have our own fork of macro test that we have to maintain just for duplicate to provide the features. And so here is kind of the immaturity, the missing features in the community. Another thing is within the cargo expand crate. So if you don't know what cargo expand is, it's a tool, it's a crate that takes some Rust file and then just outputs the expanded version of it. So if it has macros in it, then it just gives you the code that those macros become. And that's fine and works and is used by macro test. That's how macro test tests that the expansions are working. But cargo expand does not report whether a given macro call actually worked, or whether that call, whether the procedural macro threw an error, a panic. Because when it does so, cargo expand just shows you nothing, as if the macro doesn't exist. And so that was blocking us for a while because I wanted to test the error reporting of duplicate, and without knowing whether an error was given or not can be difficult. So the duplicates fork of macro tests has to just look for the word error in the output and hope that's kind of enough for recognizing whether the compiler produced an error or not while expanding. And so that's kind of, it's a shaky situation to be in. So if anyone is looking for something to do, some kind of open source stuff, that would be my two suggestions: either fork macro tests or work on cargo expand to provide these features we're using. That would be appreciated, at least from my side. Yeah. We then have something called edition leakage, and this is a term that I've made for it. Yeah, for this specific kind of result, but it comes from something called edition hygiene. And the thing is that the compiler needs to track where code comes from, right? So if duplicate, for example, uses edition 2018, but the user uses edition 2021, then the compiler needs to accept both. And so what it does is it tracks the source edition of all code in it is compiling. And yeah, crate and user might use different ones, and duplicate does use 2018. So and it's not likely to change in the foreseeable future. And so if you're creating a procedural macro, you're likely generating tokens. You're generating code, and duplicate, for example, generating code technically. And so you have to be careful to not mix your code with the user's code, because then the user might get weird errors. So what happened for us is a user gave me this code, and he was using edition 2021, but the error he was getting was your code is invalid in edition 2018, which was quite weird because he wasn't using edition 2018, but duplicate was. And what was happening here was duplicate's edition was leaking into the user's code and kind of corrupting it and making it look like it's not in the edition it actually comes from. And this is not unique to duplicate in any way. Any macro can reach this. The problem in this case comes from the fact that you can see there are parentheses in that panic. And what duplicate did was to be able to see whether within parentheses there are any identifiers needs to change. It unwraps those parentheses. And then, okay, in this case, it sees there is nothing there. So it just rewraps it with the same parentheses and spits it back out. Problem was that what duplicate was doing was creating new parentheses that are still parentheses. But since it was creating new parentheses, now those parentheses had the edition 2018. And when it spit it out, the result is this is now code that is edition 2018. And so it errored out as that, even though this is the user's code, right? And should be, hygienically separated from duplicate's code. So that was, had to figure out something there. And one thing I could say is this is extremely hard to test for, and I think it's essentially impossible to really create a perfect testing for it. But here's what I ended up choosing. Duplicate strategy was twofold. First, we want to try to avoid creating tokens on our own, because luckily mostly duplicate doesn't need to do that. In the most basic of cases, we're essentially just taking user code, copying it, and then spitting it back out. And when you copy tokens, they maintain the edition of their source. And so now you're not leaking your own edition into it. And even when we're substituting, since the code in the call is the user's code, that has the user's edition in it. And so when we're just copying the substitutions also into the user's code, everything stays on the user's edition. And so in that way, we can avoid leaking our edition into the user's code. So that's the strategy, but how really to do it is what I ended up doing was I've added a test to the code base, and what the test does is it scans the code base for the words you see here, group, : new, and if we're doing that, then we're definitely creating a group. By the way, a group is when you're making parentheses, that's called a group. So this is in the case where we'll be packaging parentheses or brackets or braces. So this test scans the code for group.new, and if it sees it, it fails. Right? So we're essentially disallowing duplicate to create any groups. Because that was our specific kind of problem here, right? But technically, if we're making tokens in some other way, this test will not catch it, right? And as I told you before, we have this module disambiguation where we're renaming modules, and in that case, we technically create tokens that now have our addition in them, and that I don't think will ever be a problem, but you never know, right? So it's still kind of a shaky situation here. And then, yeah, then the next strategy is to just have cases like this one you see here and just test them. That if I call this, well, then I will not get the error of using the wrong addition. Yeah, so if you're making a procedural macro and you're making tokens, know that this exists. But I do also think it's quite rare because you kind of have to mix. It's not enough just to create your own addition. You have to mix it with the user's additions for it to actually be a problem. Yeah. So some miscellaneous comments about procedural macros. First of all, there's something called the none delimiter, and a delimiter is parentheses, braces, or brackets. And you'd think there are only those three, and you'd actually think that the less than and greater than were delimiters, but they aren't. But there is a fourth delimiter, and it's called none, and it's invisible, and users cannot write it, but it still can be in the token stream that the procedural macro gets. And it, as far as I could tell, it comes from the fact from when macro rules get expanded, and when they expand kind of in groups, then these groups randomly, in my mind, get this none delimiter. And so, yeah, you essentially have to always assume any set of tokens can have this delimiter around them. And so you have to check for it all the time. And duplicate has specific ways of managing that. This might be everywhere. And, if it finds it, it unwraps it and acts it if it's not there. Yeah, it's annoying. It's everywhere. So be aware of it. Then there is a crate called procedural macro error, and that can help you provide nice errors for your procedural macro. This is an example of one of duplicate's errors. If something happens, if you write something in the wrong way. And if we didn't have procedural macro error, anything under the first line would not be available. So you just get this unexpected delimiter somewhere. But if you use procedural macro error, then you get this nice, very rusty way of pointing to exactly where the problem was. You, of course, need to manage these errors in your code base, but they're definitely worth it. And yeah, that kind of highlights a thing that you need to do when using procedure or creating procedural macros that you don't for any other kind of crate, which is error reporting. If you're making a crate for functions or traits, error reporting is kind of handled by the compiler. But for procedural macros, your errors get spit out as they are. Usually that's panics. So I would suggest using procedural macro error and actually having it as an active part of your code base, figuring out managing how you're reporting the errors. And yeah, for duplicate, the last step I did before releasing version 1.0 was getting getting the testing of errors working, and that was what required some of the stuff in macro tests and cargo expand. Yes, and then a last miscellaneous thing. When you have a set of attributes, there are, of course, all procedural macros. The first one in the list gets all the rest as inputs. And so you can use that as a feature in your procedural macro. So you can kind of change or add attributes into the list. And duplicate can do that. That allows you, for example, to do nested invocation by having two duplicate after each other. They can, the first one can affect the second one. But one thing to have in mind that I only learned of yesterday was that there is one exception to this, top to bottom expansion of attributes, which is that the config attribute is a special case that always goes first. And so if that one resolves to no, as in it's not going to add the item to the code, well, then none of the others work, even those come before. And yeah, just found this out yesterday. I think got the last detail in place to know that this is a known bug in the sense that it's undocumented, but it's not going to be fixed in the near future because it's going to make too many crates fail in crates.io. So for now, it's an open issue. Good. So near the end, just to summarize what we've gone over today, duplicates for avoiding repetition, and hopefully also future-proofing some of your code and making it easier to read. I went over some tips and tricks you can use, for example, using paste to provide some for you to not have to rename everything. And then we talked a little bit about how procedural macros are peculiar and how, I would suggest actively thinking about how you want to test it, whether you want to go the functional or literal way or some other way. I'm not an expert. And yeah, some special things about procedural macros, especially around addition leakage or addition hygiene that might be of relevance to you. And I suggest that if you want a project, if you want some open sourcing to maintain, then go ahead and look at macro tests and cargo expand. Those are things that would help at least me. And I know many people I probably would assume would like macro tests to be improved on, because their issue list is much more active than duplicate, for example. And in my specific case, I would also love if cargo expand could provide some kind of sign of whether errors happened or not. I haven't added it here, but of course, if you want to work on duplicate, I also have open issues. So go ahead. My recommendation, kind of after creating duplicate, is build the crate you need. So the crate that I wanted to do was graphene and graphs and stuff. But in the end, duplicate is the crate that I use on everything. I think I've used it on all projects since. And it's nice to have something that it's not a waste of my time because I'm using it all the time. So even if no one else is, then at least I'm getting something out of it. And then announce on Reddit, because that's where your users come from, and users are quite useful, and I want to acknowledge them for reporting bugs and asking for features. I think other than what you've seen today, and other than after the first year, most features that I've implemented for duplicates come from someone either asking how to do something or asking for some feature. And then, me seeing it, that's obviously a good idea, and doing that and then using it afterwards, right? And so I get something out of it too. So thanks to all of them, and if anyone knows them, then please say hi. And then of course, thanks to you guys for the invites. Thanks to Scott for giving me some feedback earlier, and for you guys' attention. And I've added some links here to, first of all, my GitHub and Duplicate's GitHub, which is in my own. My Reddit name, Immune1, and then LinkedIn. I hope to probably need a job by end of year or next year. So if you're looking for a compiler guy in real-time systems, then maybe next year. That's my LinkedIn. So with that, I think I'll say thank you for listening. And if anyone has questions and comments, I'm happy to answer.